The Tuesday evening chess club at the Riverside Community Center had become something of a ritual for its members. Every week, the same group of men would gather around the polished wooden tables, moving their pieces with practiced confidence while discussing stock markets and business deals between moves. The air always smelled faintly of coffee and old books, and the sound of chess clocks ticking created a rhythm that the regulars found comforting. Margaret Chen pushed her cleaning cart quietly along the side of the room, careful not to disturb the players. She had worked at the community center for nearly 15 years now, and she knew the schedule by heart. Tuesday nights meant the chess club. Wednesday mornings brought the yoga classes. Fridays were reserved for the children's art program. Her job was simple: keep everything clean, stay invisible, and don't make noise. She was good at being invisible. At 52, with gray streaks running through her pulled-back hair and wearing the same blue work uniform every day, most people looked right past her. That was fine with Margaret. She preferred it that way. Less attention meant fewer questions, and fewer questions meant she could just do her work and go home to her small apartment where she lived alone. But there was one problem with her invisibility on Tuesday nights. Margaret loved chess. She couldn't help herself. During her breaks, she would stand near the back of the room, pretending to wipe down tables or organize chairs, while her eyes followed the games. She watched the players move their knights and bishops, saw them castle their kings, observed their mistakes and their brilliant moves. Sometimes her fingers would twitch slightly, as if her hands remembered something her mind had tried to forget. Richard Hartwell had been president of the chess club for 3 years. He was the kind of man who wore expensive watches and talked loudly about his vacation home in the mountains. His hair was always perfectly styled, and his suits probably cost more than Margaret made in a month. Richard liked to win, and he especially liked people to see him win. He played aggressively, sometimes taking unnecessary risks just to make the game more dramatic for whoever was watching. On this particular Tuesday evening, Richard was in the middle of explaining his latest victory to 2 newer club members. His voice carried across the room as he demonstrated the final moves that had led to his opponent's resignation. "You see, the key to chess is understanding that it's not just about the pieces," Richard said, moving his hands dramatically. "It's about psychology. It's about reading your opponent, understanding their weaknesses, exploiting their fears." That's when he noticed Margaret. She was standing about 10 feet away, supposedly dusting a bookshelf, but her eyes were fixed on the chessboard. Richard paused mid-sentence, a slow smile spreading across his face. Well, he said, his voice taking on a tone that made the other members look up. "It seems we have an audience. Tell me, do you play chess?" Margaret felt her face flush. She hadn't meant to stare so obviously. "No, sir," she said quietly, turning back to her cleaning. "I'm sorry for disturbing you." "Oh, you're not disturbing us," Richard said, standing up and walking toward her. "I'm genuinely curious. You watch us every week. Surely you must have picked up something about the game by now." The other club members were starting to take notice. A few of them chuckled softly. Margaret recognized that sound. It was the same laugh people made when they found something amusing in a condescending way. "I know a little," Margaret admitted, still not meeting his eyes. Just from watching," Richard repeated, looking back at his companions. "Isn't that charming? She thinks she's learned chess just from watching." He turned back to Margaret with exaggerated politeness. "You know, chess is called the game of kings for a reason. It takes years of study, of practice, of understanding complex strategies and tactics. It's not something you can pick up by dusting furniture while real players compete." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. It was an old, familiar pain, like pressing on a bruise that had never quite healed. She should have just nodded and walked away. That's what she always did when people talked down to her. Keep your head down, finish your work, go home. That was her rule. But something in Richard's voice, something in the way he was looking at her like she was a child who didn't know any better, made her meet his eyes. "I understand more than you might think," she said softly. The room had gone quiet now. Even the players at the other tables had stopped their games to watch the exchange. Richard's smile widened. This was getting interesting. "Really? Then perhaps you'd like to play a game. I'm sure we could all use some entertainment." He glanced around at the other members who were now openly grinning. "What do you say, everyone? Should we have a special exhibition match? Myself against our dedicated cleaning lady?" One of the members, a lawyer named Douglas who always wore bow ties, spoke up. "That seems a bit unfair, Richard. She's never played before. "Oh, I'll be gentle," Richard said, waving his hand dismissively. "Think of it as a teaching moment. A charitable lesson, if you will. Besides, she said she understands the game. Let's see if that's true." Margaret knew exactly what this was. She'd seen this kind of thing before years ago in different circumstances. This wasn't about chess. This was about putting someone in their place, about reinforcing the invisible lines that separated people like Richard from people like her. He wanted to humiliate her, to prove that knowing your place in the world meant staying there. She should have said no. Every practical instinct told her to decline politely, to apologize for the presumption, to go back to being invisible. But that old pain in her chest had awakened something else too, something she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten it existed. It was pride. Or maybe it was just exhaustion from 3 decades of being looked through rather than looked at. "All right," she heard herself say. "I'll play." Richard actually clapped his hands together. "Wonderful." "This is wonderful. Let's make it official, shall we? Next Tuesday, same time, we'll set up a board right here in the center of the room. I'll give you a week to prepare, study up, watch some videos online. It'll be educational for everyone." He was already talking to the other members, turning her acceptance into an event. Someone suggested they should put up a sign. Another thought they should invite some of the other community center regulars to watch. The whole thing was escalating, turning into a spectacle, and Margaret realized with a sinking feeling that she'd just walked into exactly what Richard had wanted. Douglas, the bow-tie lawyer, approached her after Richard had gone back to his game. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said quietly. "Richard can be a bit much sometimes. No one would blame you if you changed your mind." Margaret looked at him. There was genuine concern in his eyes, which made her feel slightly better about the situation. "It's just a game," she said, though they both knew that wasn't quite true. "Richard doesn't believe in just a game," Douglas warned. "He's going to make this as public as possible. Are you sure you're ready for that?" Was she ready? Margaret wasn't sure. But she'd already said yes, and backing out now would only confirm everything Richard believed about her. "I'll be fine," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. That night, after her shift ended and she'd taken the bus home to her quiet apartment, Margaret sat in her small kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. She hadn't touched a chessboard in 30 years. She'd promised herself she never would again. The game held too many memories, too much pain, too many reminders of a life she'd had to give up. But now she'd agreed to play. And not just play, but play in front of an audience, against someone who intended to humiliate her. Margaret closed her eyes and took a slow breath. She could still see the patterns in her mind, the way pieces moved across the squares, the combinations and tactics that had once been as natural to her as breathing. The question wasn't whether she remembered how to play. The question was whether she could let herself remember without falling apart. She had 7 days to decide if she'd made a terrible mistake, or if perhaps after all these years it was finally time to stop being invisible. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move across the plaster as cars passed on the street below. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw chessboards. Not the clean, polished boards at the community center, but an old wooden set with pieces worn smooth from use, set up on a kitchen table that no longer existed in a home she'd lost decades ago. The next morning, she went through her usual routine. Wake up at 6, shower, oatmeal for breakfast. Check the weather. Catch the 7:15 bus that would get her to the community center by 8. Everything the same as always. But inside, something had shifted. The quiet life she'd built so carefully, brick by brick, year after year, felt suddenly fragile. During her lunch break, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She took out her phone, the basic model she'd bought 3 years ago and barely used for anything except calls, and searched for something. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed the words into the search bar. Margaret Tan Chess Prodigy 1990s. The results that came up made her breath catch. There were old newspaper articles, scanned and uploaded to various chess history websites. Photos too, grainy and faded, showy. A young woman with long black hair and fierce, determined eyes, sitting across from opponents twice her age. That person looked like a stranger to her now. One article was titled, "The Rising Star, Margaret Tan's Rapid Ascent in American Chess." She'd been 21 when it was written. Another headline read, "Tan defeats international master in stunning upset." She remembered that game. She remembered all of them, actually, though she'd tried so hard not to. Margaret quickly closed the browser and put the phone away, her heart racing. She wasn't ready to look at that past yet. Maybe she'd never be ready. But that night, memories came anyway, whether she wanted them or not. She'd been 7 years old when her father first showed her how the pieces moved. They'd just immigrated to San Francisco, and her father was driving a taxi 12 hours a day, trying to make enough money to bring her mother and younger siblings over from their home country. In the evenings, in their tiny one-room apartment, he would set up the chessboard he'd carried with him across the ocean. "Your grandfather taught me this game," he'd said in their native language, his rough hands carefully placing the pieces on the board. "And his father taught him. Now I teach you." Chess became their language when his English failed and her childhood words weren't enough to bridge the gap between them. On the board, they understood each other perfectly. He taught her not just how to move the pieces, but how to see the whole board at once, how to think 3 moves ahead, then 5, then 10. By the time she was 10, she was beating him regularly. By 12, she was entering local tournaments and winning against players who'd been studying the game for decades. Her father would take time off from driving his taxi to bring her to competitions, sitting in the audience with a thermos of tea and a quiet smile on his tired face. "You have a gift," he told her once, after she'd won a particularly important match. "Not just in your mind, but in your spirit. You see the beauty in the game, not just the winning." When she was 14, a man named Viktor Sokolov came to watch one of her tournaments. He was a Russian chess master, an old man with a thick accent and eyes that seemed to see through everything. After her victory, he approached her father and spoke to him for a long time in careful, formal English. "He wants to train you," her father translated, his eyes bright with tears he was too proud to shed. "He says you could be special, very special." Victor became her mentor, her teacher, her second father in some ways. He ran a small chess academy in a converted warehouse downtown, where serious students came to study. He gave Margaret a full scholarship and began teaching her in earnest. Not just openings and endgames, but chess philosophy, chess history, the games of the great masters going back hundreds of years. "Chess is not about memorizing moves," Victor would say in his thick accent, tapping his temple with one gnarled finger. "It is about understanding truth. Every position tells you truth if you listen. You must learn to hear it." Margaret had learned to hear it. By 16, she was competing in national tournaments. By 18, she'd earned her master rating. By 20, she was being talked about as a potential grandmaster candidate, one of the few women in the country with that kind of promise. Those were golden years, filled with chess and possibility. Her whole family had made it to America by then, crowded into a small apartment but together. Her father still drove his taxi, but with less desperation now. Her mother worked as a seamstress. Her 3 younger siblings were in school, adapting to their new country faster than their parents could. Margaret was the success story, the proof that their sacrifice had been worth it. Newspapers wrote about her. Chess publications interviewed her. Victor told her she could make a career of it, teaching and competing, maybe even writing books one day. Then, 3 months after her 22nd birthday, everything ended. The phone call came at 2 in the morning. A police officer with a kind voice explained that there had been an accident. A drunk driver had run a red light. Her parents, coming home from her mother's night shift at the garment factory, hadn't stood a chance. Margaret remembered screaming, but she didn't remember the sound. She remembered falling to her knees in the kitchen, still holding the phone, but she didn't remember how she got there. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and funeral arrangements and relatives speaking in hushed voices about what would happen now. What happened now was that Margaret, at 22, became the guardian of 3 children. Her sister was 14. Her brothers were 12 and 9. They had no other family in America, and sending them back to their birth country to distant relatives they barely knew was unthinkable. The life insurance money wouldn't last long. Margaret had exactly $300 in her bank account, and no job except chess, which paid nothing unless you won major tournaments consistently. She had rent to pay, food to buy, 3 children who needed clothes and school supplies and stability in a world that had just collapsed around them. Victor came to see her a week after the funeral. They sat in the small apartment living room while her siblings were at school, and he held her hand while she cried. "You must continue," he said gently. "Your parents would want this. You are so close to greatness, Margaret. So close. How?" she'd asked. "How can I travel to tournaments? How can I study 8 hours a day? I have to take care of them." "We will find a way," Victor had insisted. "Perhaps family, perhaps scholarships, perhaps—" "There is no way," Margaret said, and hearing herself say it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. "I have to get a job. A real job. One that pays every week, not just when I win." She'd withdrawn from the tournament she'd been preparing for. Then she'd withdrawn from all the others. She'd taken the first job she could find that paid enough to cover rent and food, working as a hotel housekeeper. Then she'd found a second job cleaning offices at night. Victor had called, had visited, had begged her to reconsider, but eventually he'd stopped. What could he say? She was right. There was no way. Margaret had packed up her chess set, the one her father had brought from across the ocean, and put it in the back of the closet. She told herself it was temporary. Once her siblings were older, once they were settled, maybe she could play again. But months turned into years, and years turned into decades, and the chess set stayed in the closet. And then eventually it stayed in a box in storage, and then eventually she wasn't sure where it was anymore. Her sister graduated high school, then college. She became a doctor, working at a hospital in Seattle now. The older of her brothers became a teacher, with a wife and 2 kids of his own. The younger became an engineer with a tech company. They called Margaret every week. They sent her money sometimes, which she always tried to refuse. They told her they owed her everything, and she told them they didn't owe her anything at all. But she'd never told them what she'd given up. They'd been too young to really understand what chess had meant to her, what future she'd walked away from. They knew she used to play, knew she'd been good, but they didn't know about Victor, about the path to Grandmaster, about the life that could have been. Now lying in her bed at 52, Margaret realized that she'd become invisible so gradually she hadn't noticed it happening. First, she'd made herself invisible to the chess world, disappearing so completely that people assumed she'd quit because she wasn't good enough. Then she'd made herself invisible at work, just another cleaning person that no one looked at twice. Then she'd made herself invisible in her own life, living alone in a small apartment, going through motions, existing but not quite living. And now Richard Hartwell, with his expensive watch and his casual cruelty, had seen her, really seen her, even if he'd seen the wrong thing. And in trying to humiliate her, he'd done something she wasn't sure he'd intended. He'd reminded her that she was still there, still real, still capable of being more than invisible. Margaret got out of bed and turned on the light. Somewhere in the back of her closet, she knew there was an old cardboard box. She hadn't opened it in 15 years, maybe longer. But if she was going to do this, if she was really going to step back into that world even for just one game, she needed to remember not just the moves, but who she'd been when making those moves had mattered. She found the box pushed far back behind winter coats she never wore. When she opened it, the smell of old wood and leather rose up, and with it, a flood of memories so strong she had to sit down on the floor. The chess set was there, pieces wrapped individually in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. Beneath it were score sheets from old games, notebooks filled with her analysis in handwriting that looked like it belonged to a different person, and a photograph. In the photo, she stood between her father and Victor, holding a trophy from some tournament she'd won. She was smiling. She looked happy. She looked alive. Margaret held the photograph for a long time, studying the face of the young woman she'd been. Then she carefully unwrapped the chess pieces and set them up on her kitchen table. The king's knight, the queen's bishop, the pawns in their starting positions. Her hands remembered the weight of them, the shape of them. She had 6 more days until the match. 6 days to remember 3 decades of rust. 6 days to decide if she was going to let Richard Hartwell expose her as a fraud, or if she was going to show him, and maybe show herself, that some things you never really forget. The week passed both too quickly and too slowly. During the day, Margaret cleaned the community center as always. But at night, she sat at her kitchen table with the old chess set, playing through games from memory. Her fingers moved pieces across the board while her mind traveled back through decades, remembering patterns and strategies she thought she'd forgotten. By Thursday, word of the match had spread beyond the chess club. Someone had posted about it on the community center's social media page, framing it as a feel-good story about inclusion and breaking barriers. Margaret saw the post when one of the other cleaning staff showed it to her on their phone during lunch break. "Look, you're famous," the woman said, smiling. "That's so nice of them to let you play. Margaret just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They didn't understand. This wasn't about being nice. This was about Richard proving a point, about putting on a show. But she couldn't explain that without explaining everything else, and everything else was still too raw, too complicated. On Friday, a young reporter from the local newspaper showed up. She was maybe 25, with an eager smile and a notebook full of questions. She found Margaret during her afternoon shift and asked if she could do a quick interview. "We think it's such an inspiring story," the reporter said. "A regular working woman challenging herself to learn something new, stepping outside her comfort zone. Can you tell me what made you decide to play?" Margaret stood there with her mop, searching for words that wouldn't be lies but wouldn't be the whole truth either. "I've always been interested in chess," she finally said. "This seemed like an opportunity." "And are you nervous about playing against the club president? He's apparently quite good." "Everyone gets nervous sometimes," Margaret replied carefully. The article came out on Sunday in the local interest section. The headline read, "Community Center Worker Takes on Chess Club in Friendly Match." It was a short piece, only a few paragraphs, but it painted Richard as a generous teacher, and Margaret as a brave amateur trying something new. The whole tone made her stomach twist. They'd gotten it all wrong, but how could they know? She hadn't told them anything real. By Monday evening, Margaret's sister called from Seattle. She'd seen the article somehow, shared online through the network of people who'd grown up in their neighborhood. "Margaret, why didn't you tell me you were playing chess again?" "It's just one game," Margaret said, stirring soup on her stove with one hand while holding the phone with the other. "It's nothing, but you love chess. You gave it up for us." Her sister's voice went quiet. "I never knew how much you'd given up until I was older. I wish you'd gone back to it. I had other responsibilities. We're grown now. We have our own lives. Maybe this is your chance to have something for yourself again." After they hung up, Margaret sat with her soup getting cold, thinking about chances and time and all the years that had passed. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Tomorrow was the match, and she still didn't know if she was making a terrible mistake. Tuesday arrived with gray skies and a chance of rain. Margaret went to work early, finishing her regular cleaning duties before the evening crowd arrived. The community center director, a kind woman named Helen who'd always been fair to Margaret, found her in the supply closet. "I'm sorry about all this fuss," Helen said. "If I'd known Richard was going to turn it into such an event, I might have intervened. You can still back out if you want. I'll handle Richard." Margaret appreciated the offer, but she shook her head. "I said I'd play. I'll play." By 6 o'clock, the main room had been transformed. Someone had moved the tables to create a central space where a single chessboard sat under bright lights. Chairs had been arranged around it like a small theater. The regular chess club members were already there, but so were dozens of others. Margaret saw people from the yoga class, from the senior center, from the neighborhood. She even spotted the young reporter from the newspaper, camera in hand. Her hands started to shake. This was too much. Too many people, too much attention, too much pressure. She thought about walking out the back door, getting on a bus, and never coming back. But then she saw Richard, and the look on his face stopped her. He was in his element, shaking hands and laughing, wearing what was probably his most expensive suit. He looked supremely confident, and why wouldn't he be? To him, this was entertainment. To him, Margaret was a punchline waiting to happen. Douglas, the bow-tie lawyer, appeared at Margaret's elbow. "You still have time to walk away," he said quietly. "This has gotten out of hand." "I'm staying," Margaret said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. At exactly 7 o'clock, Richard called everyone to attention. He gave a small speech about the beauty of chess, about how it brings people together across all boundaries, about how tonight was a celebration of that spirit. He made it sound noble. He made it sound like he was doing Margaret a favor. "And now," Richard said, gesturing toward Margaret, "let me introduce my opponent for the evening, Margaret Chen, who has worked at this community center for many years and who has kindly agreed to let me teach her the finer points of the game we all love." There was polite applause. Margaret walked to the board, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She sat in the chair across from Richard, her hands clasped in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Since you're the beginner, I'll play white and let you have the advantage of watching my moves first," Richard said loudly enough for the audience to hear. He was still performing, still playing to the crowd. "I'll try not to make it too complicated." The game began. Richard played pawn to e4. A standard opening, confident and clean. He looked at Margaret with an expression that was probably meant to be encouraging, but came across as condescending. Margaret took a breath. Her hand moved to her pieces and something strange happened. The moment her fingers touched the smooth wood of the pawn, something clicked into place inside her. The shaking stopped. The noise of the crowd faded. The years fell away. She moved her pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. It was like her hand remembered before her mind did. Muscle memory from hundreds, maybe thousands of games played decades ago. Richard's smile flickered just slightly. "Ah, you've been studying," he said. "Good, good. This is one of the most popular defenses. Let me show you how white typically responds." He played knight to f3, and Margaret responded with pawn to d6. Then Richard played d4, and Margaret captured with her c-pawn. The opening was unfolding exactly as it should, exactly as Victor had taught her all those years ago. "You're doing well," Richard said, but there was a tiny edge to his voice now. "Have you been practicing online, perhaps?" Margaret didn't answer. She was too focused on the board, on the patterns emerging, on the position developing. Richard castled kingside and Margaret played knight to f6. Then Richard pushed his pawn to f3, preparing an aggressive kingside expansion, and Margaret quietly developed her knight to c6. By move 10, something had changed in the room. The chess club members who'd been chatting and laughing were now quiet, leaning forward to see the board. Richard was taking longer with each move, his confidence starting to chip away at the edges. Margaret wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. She wasn't thinking about Richard or the humiliation he'd intended for her. She was thinking about the board, about the pieces, about the truth of the position that Victor had taught her to see. And the truth was clear. She had a good position. Not just good, but strong. Richard tried an aggressive pawn push on move 13, probably trying to create complications that would confuse an amateur. But Margaret saw through it immediately. She calmly continued developing her pieces, improving her position, preparing for the middle game. Each move was precise, economical, purposeful. By move 15, Richard's forehead was shining with sweat. He'd stopped talking to the audience. His moves were coming slower now, and Margaret noticed his hand wasn't quite steady when he reached for his pieces. The position on the board was telling its truth, and the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret had better piece placement. Her knights were perfectly coordinated. Her bishop was controlling key diagonal. Her position was the kind that her younger self would have called just better, the chess term for a clear advantage that's hard to explain but impossible to deny. Douglas stood up from his chair in the audience, moving closer to see the board better. A few other club members did the same. Someone whispered something, but Margaret didn't hear what it was. All her attention was on the board, on the beautiful complexity of the position, on the possibilities branching out before her. Richard tried to create an attack, pushing his pawns forward and bringing his queen into the game aggressively. It was the kind of flashy play that probably worked against weaker opponents, the kind of play that looked dangerous if you didn't see deep enough. But Margaret saw deeper. She'd always seen deeper. She calmly redeployed her knight, and suddenly Richard's attack looked overextended. His pawns were weak. His king was exposed. The position had shifted from slightly better for Margaret to clearly winning, and it had happened so smoothly that Richard seemed surprised by it. "That's..." Richard started, then stopped. He stared at the board for a long moment. "That's a very good move." Margaret looked up at him for the first time since the game. He had started really looking at him, and she saw confusion on his face and something else. It might have been the first flicker of understanding that something wasn't right here, that this wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Thank you," Margaret said simply. Richard turned to the board again, studying it intensely. The room had gone almost completely silent. Even people who didn't play chess could sense that something unexpected was happening. Margaret waited patiently while Richard thought, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her breathing steady. When Richard finally made his move, it was defensive, tentative, so different from the confident opening he'd started with. Margaret responded immediately, no hesitation, and she saw Richard's eyes widen slightly. "You're not a beginner," he said quietly. It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "No," she said. "I'm not." Someone in the back of the room gasped. The sound seemed to break a spell. and suddenly everyone was leaning forward, murmuring to each other, trying to understand what was happening. But Margaret kept her focus on the board, on the game, on the beautiful, terrible truth that after 30 years of silence she was playing chess again, and it felt like coming home. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Richard sat frozen at the board, staring at the position as if seeing it for the first time. His carefully constructed confidence had crumbled, replaced by something Margaret recognized from her old tournament days. The desperate focus of someone who realizes they're losing and doesn't know how it happened. Margaret moved her rook to the open file, a quiet move that didn't look particularly threatening, but fundamentally changed the position. She could see several moves ahead now, the combinations flowing through her mind like water finding its path. It was all still there. All the training Victor had given her, all the hours of study, all the games. It had just been sleeping. Richard spent nearly 5 minutes on his next move, which was unusually long for what should have been a casual game. When he finally played, pushing a pawn to try to create some counterplay, Margaret saw immediately that it was a mistake. Not a huge blunder, but the kind of small error that good players punish ruthlessly. She advanced her knight, forking his rook and bishop. Richard's face went pale. He'd have to lose material now, there was no way around it. He chose to save the rook, moving it away, and Margaret captured the bishop. The material advantage wasn't huge, but combined with her better position, the game was essentially over. Anyone strong enough would know it. "Excuse me," a voice called from the crowd. An elderly man was standing up, squinting at Margaret through thick glasses. "Excuse me, but I need to see something." The man pushed his way toward the front. He was probably in his 70s, with wild white hair and a wool cardigan that had seen better days. Something about him seemed familiar to Margaret, but she couldn't place it. "Dmitri," Douglas said, recognizing him first. "Dmitri Sokolov? I didn't know you were in town." Margaret's breath caught. Sokolov, Victor's son. She'd met him once, maybe twice, decades ago when he was a young man just starting his career as a chess journalist. He'd be in his 70s now, she calculated quickly. The same age Victor would have been if he'd lived longer. Dmitri moved closer to the board, studying not the position but Margaret's face. "The way you play," he said slowly, his accent thicker than his father's had been. "The knight maneuver on move 18, the pawn structure you built in the opening. I know this style." Margaret felt her heart racing again, but for a different reason now. "My father taught only a handful of students his particular method," Dmitri continued, still staring at her. "The way you improve pieces before attacking, the patience you show." He called it building the cathedral before ringing the bells. Dmitri's eyes went wide. "Margaret? Margaret Tan?" The room erupted. People started talking all at once, pulling out phones, some Googling the name, others trying to see the board better. Richard looked from Dmitri to Margaret, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "Wait," Richard said. "Margaret Tan? The prodigy? That Margaret Tan. You know about her?" someone asked. "Everyone in serious chess knows about her," Richard said, his voice hollow. "She was being groomed for Grandmaster. She beat multiple international masters in her early 20s. Then she just vanished. People assumed she couldn't handle the pressure, that she'd washed out." "I didn't wash out," Margaret said quietly, but the room had gone silent enough that everyone heard her. "I had responsibilities." Dmitri moved even closer, his eyes shining with something that might have been tears. "My father never stopped talking about you. Even years later, even after he was sick, he would say, 'I wonder what happened to my student who could see the truth of the board.' He died not knowing." Margaret felt something break open inside her chest. "I'm sorry. I should have contacted him. I should have explained. Why did you stop?" someone in the crowd asked. Margaret looked at all the faces staring at her, waiting for an answer. She could feel the weight of Richard's humiliation, the shock of the chess club members, the confused curiosity of the people who'd just come to watch what they thought would be an amusing mismatch. And she thought about her sister in Seattle, her brothers with their own families, the life she'd built from the wreckage of the one she'd lost. "My parents died," she said simply. "I had siblings to raise. Chess doesn't pay the bills when you're 22 with 3 children to feed." The room stayed quiet. Even Richard looked down at his hands. Dmitri pulled out his phone with shaking fingers. "I have to tell people. The chess world thought you were lost. They need to know you're here. They need to know you still play like this. Please." Margaret said, but Dmitri was already typing, his thumbs moving quickly across the screen. We should finish the game, Douglas said, perhaps sensing that Margaret needed a moment to process everything. Unless Richard would like to resign? Richard looked at the board, at his weakened position, at Margaret sitting calmly across from him. I think we both know how this ends, he said, but there was no graciousness in his voice, only bitterness. But no, I don't resign. If we're going to finish this, let's finish it properly. They returned to the game, but it was different now. The secret was out. People were whispering Margaret's name, Googling her on their phones, finding old articles and photos. Someone had pulled up a chess database and was looking through her old games. The young reporter was recording video, probably already thinking about the real story she'd write. Margaret tried to focus on the board, but the exposure felt like standing naked in front of strangers. For 30 years she'd been invisible, and now suddenly everyone could see her. Not just see her, but see what she'd been, what she'd given up, what she'd lost. Richard played desperately now, trying tricks and traps that might work against weak players, but were transparent to someone of Margaret's level. She defended calmly, then transitioned into an endgame where her extra piece would be decisive. The technical phase of chess, where precision mattered more than creativity, had always been one of her strengths. By move 30, Richard's position was hopeless. He had a rook and a few pawns against Margaret's rook, bishop, and pawns. He couldn't create threats, couldn't generate counterplay, couldn't do anything except delay the inevitable. Dmitri had finished with his phone and was now commentating the position to the people around him, explaining what Margaret was doing, why each move was perfect, how she was squeezing Richard's position like a vice closing slowly. It was strange hearing her chess analyzed, hearing someone appreciate the technique she'd thought no one would ever see again. More people had arrived, word having spread through social media that something interesting was happening at the community center. The room was packed now, standing room only, everyone trying to see the board. Margaret noticed Helen, the center director, looking concerned about the fire code, but she didn't stop the crowd. Richard made another move, and Margaret saw the finish. 5 moves, maybe 6 if he tried something pointless. She could end it now with a forcing sequence, or she could let him suffer a bit longer, drag it out, make the humiliation last. Part of her, the part that had felt small and invisible for so many years, wanted exactly that. But then she remembered her father, remembered how he'd taught her chess wasn't about humiliating opponents, but about finding truth. She remembered Victor saying that the game itself was reward enough, that crushing someone's spirit was never the point. She played the forcing sequence. Her bishop moved to a perfect square. Her rook swung to the 7th rank. Her pawns advanced in perfect coordination. It was clinical, efficient, beautiful in its precision. Richard had no answer, no defense, no hope. On move 34, Margaret moved her queen to h7. It was a queen sacrifice. The piece just sitting there undefended, and for a moment Richard looked confused. Then he saw it. If he took the queen, her rook would deliver checkmate on the next move. If he didn't take it, she had unstoppable threats. Either way, the game was over. Checkmate in 2, Richard said, his voice barely audible. He laid down his king in the universal gesture of resignation. I resign. The room exploded with applause. People were standing, cheering, some of them crying. Dmitri was hugging strangers. Douglas was shaking his head in amazement. Even some of the chess club members who'd laughed at Margaret a week ago were clapping, though they looked embarrassed about it. Richard stood up without shaking Margaret's hand, without meeting her eyes, and walked quickly toward the exit. A few people tried to stop him, to say something, but he pushed past them and disappeared into the night. Margaret watched him go and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, no joy in his humiliation. She just felt tired. That was the silent storm, Dmitri said, pointing at the final position. My father's signature combination. Queen sacrifice forcing mate with the rook. He used it in his famous game against Petrosian in 1969. I've only seen 3 players execute it perfectly in actual games. You're one of them. People surrounded Margaret now, everyone talking at once, asking questions, taking photos, congratulating her. Someone wanted her autograph. Someone else was asking about coaching. The reporter was trying to get an interview. It was overwhelming, suffocating, too much all at once. Please, Margaret said, standing up. I need some air. Douglas helped clear a path for her, and she made it outside into the cool evening. The rain had started, just a light drizzle, and Margaret stood under the overhang, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. Dmitri followed her out. "I'm sorry," he said. "This must be overwhelming. But Margaret, you need to know what this means. The chess world thought you were a cautionary tale, a player who couldn't handle the pressure, but you're here, and you still play like that even after 30 years away. It's remarkable. I raised 3 children," Margaret said. "I worked 2 jobs. I kept a family together when it should have fallen apart." "That's remarkable. The chess was just something I used to do. But you could do it again," Dmitri pressed. "There are senior tournaments, women's championships, coaching opportunities. My father's teaching could reach new students through you. You could write about his methods, preserve his legacy, and more than that, you could have something for yourself again." Margaret looked back through the window at the crowd still gathered around the chessboard, already replaying the game, analyzing the moves. She could hear their voices even through the glass, excited and animated. She'd won a chess game, and somehow that had transformed her from invisible to visible in a matter of hours. But visibility, she was learning, came with a cost. Everyone wanted something from her now. A story, a lesson, an inspiration, a piece of her past, and she wasn't sure she was ready to give any of it.